Welcome back to our web development series where we're going through just some of the basics of HTML right now. In this video, we're going to look at forms and input and how we can use forms in our HTML to actually input data into our backend and into our application and use that. So here, you'll notice I have just basically the boilerplate code. So if you delete that out and do the exclamation mark and use this Emmet abbreviation, it gives you this code, and I'm just going to rename that to forms because that's what we're talking about in this video. And then inside of the body, let's go ahead and create a form. And this action, basically this action is what action do you want to perform whenever you execute this form or whenever you submit this form. And I'm just going to say script.js. We don't have this file, obviously. We haven't learned JavaScript yet, so we don't need to worry about what that is actually doing right now. In this video, we're just going to look at how we can create the HTML form that we're going to use later. So just above this form, actually, let's go ahead and put a header in there. And we'll just make this a form for student information. So there we go, student information. And then inside of this form, there's a whole bunch of different things that we can take for students. First, and the most obvious, is going to be their name. So in here, if I say name, and then input, and then you'll see the default type on an input is text. So if I save this, now I have this little name field, and next to it, I have this text box that I can type in, and I can put whatever I want to put in there. So, I mean, it's ugly, but we haven't got to CSS yet, so we're not really worried about how ugly our forms look and how ugly our output looks. That'll get much better when we get further along in the class, but definitely this is what we want. So what I'm going to do, we've got this name, and then in here, you've got this type text. Well, we want a few more things, right? So we can say number, and then add another input. And this input, I don't actually want this to be text, because if I have that, now if I go to type my number in, and I type in letters, well, that's not a valid phone number. So text is not what we want there. Instead, we can change that to number. Now, if I go over and type in a number and then try to type letters, I'm not going to get anything, except you'll notice I can type an E. And the reason for that is this number field is not specific to phone numbers. This is any number. And in mathematics, E stands for exponentiation. So 84E3 technically means 84 times 10 to the third power. But we don't worry about that if that just went over your head. Just know that you actually can type an E using that number, but really it's safe for all numbers, but not necessarily phone numbers. But for now, that's fine. Now, another thing I would like, well, one, these are both on the same line. So because we're not using CSS yet, I'm just going to add some breaks in here just to space it out just a little bit, make it look a little bit better. When we are using CSS to style stuff, we won't use that. But actually, this name, what I'm going to do here, instead of having name and then an input, I really want this name to be kind of linked with my input, right? So if I click on the name instead of the text box, I want the text box to go active. So the way that I can do that is instead of having name here, what I need to do is actually put that name into what we call a label. So here I can say label, and then inside of my label, I'm going to put the name with the colon, and you'll notice I have this for attribute that's going to be required. And basically what that is this for attribute is telling this label what input box I'm assigned to. So in this case, I want it to be my input right here for the text. But how do I know which input that is if I have this input and they're both HTML input fields? Well, there's another attribute you can assign in here called ID. And an ID is something that has to be unique. I can't assign the same ID to two different elements. Every single ID in at least within a file must be unique. So this ID, I'm going to say name, or maybe student name. And then I'm going to copy that. And over in the for, I'm going to say this label is now for the element with the ID student name. So now if I save that, and if I click on my name, the text, or the label rather, you can see that it actually highlights the box, and I can type my name into my input box. And we want to do that same thing down here. So let's take that number out, and we're going to make a label. And then label for, this will be, let's see, ID equals, we can say phone number, and go ahead and copy that ID. And then in the for, we'll do phone number. And whoops, that just disappeared. We got to put an actual label inside of that label. So there we go. And now if I click on number, you can see I can type in there. And if I click on number, it does in fact select the box. And there's one more thing I want to do here because this is getting a little bit crowded. We've got our label and then we've got our input. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a div. And a div, if you don't know this yet, you probably don't because we haven't covered it in this class, but a div is one of the most widely used tags in HTML, and it just stands for divider. So think of this like this div is going to divide everything that's inside of it from everything outside of it. So it's kind of like a container that you can put things in, or a box that you just put things in to organize them. And now I have both of those inside of a div. I'm going to make another div down here, and I'm going to copy, or cut rather, and put both of these inside of a div. And if I save that now, you could see that we have our name and then we have our number. And I'm actually going to delete one of those line breaks because the div gives us a little bit of spacing with it. So now I have a name and a number. And then after that, let's go ahead and add another input for an email. So we'll do another line break and then another div. And then inside of this div, we're going to have a label. And the label is going to be for email. And inside here, we're going to say email, colon. And then after that, same thing, we're going to do input. And then this input, instead of being type text, is going to be type email. And we'll give it an ID equal to email. Now, if I save that, you can see I have my email, my number, and my name. But there's one more thing I want to add to this form. And you've probably noticed when you fill out forms online, oftentimes before you click in there, they have a hint or a placeholder for what you're supposed to put into each form. Well, we can do that here as well. So if I click at the end of each one of these, we can add another attribute in here called a placeholder. And that is going to be equal to, just here, we're going to say name. Here, we're going to say phone number. And then here, we're going to say email. So now on the form, we've got our name. And if we click on it, it says name in there because it's telling us what to type. But if we start typing, that hint or that placeholder goes away on all of these. So as soon as you enter something in there, that hint goes away. But if I delete everything out, the hint comes back. Now let's keep going. After this, we're going to have our radio buttons. So let's do another div inside here. And a radio button is essentially, it's like on the old school radios when you would push one button down, the other buttons would pop up. So you can only actually have one push down at a time. So these are for mutually exclusive options. So if we wanted to do something like your gender, we could say gender, and then in here we could say male, and then input. And instead of, if you go through, there's a whole bunch of these in here, but you can just type input and then radio, and it'll pop up. And you see you get type radio, name is going to be equal to gender. And then the ID we don't need to use, but you can use that if you want to. And then after male, we could say female. And then this is going to be the same thing. Input, input radio. And then in here, if I go ahead and save that now, you'll see I get gender, male, and female. And if I click on male, it selects it. And if I click on female, it selects it too. And this is obviously false, right? You can't be male and female. That's just not a possibility. So we need to fix that. And the reason that it's letting me do that right now is because I have name equal to gender and then name equal to blank. Basically, if you want to group your radio buttons together, this name for all grouped radio buttons has to be the same. So if I have gender here, then I need to put gender down here as well. Now if I save that, I can only have male or female. So if I click on one of them, it'll deselect the other one. And that's exactly what we want because, again, radio buttons are for mutually exclusive data. Now, if you want to be able to select both of them, well, then you don't want a radio button. You want something called a checkbox. So within this next div, let's go ahead and make some checkboxes here. And typically, like when you sign up for a school or for a really anything, there's going to be a series of waivers. You know, do you allow us to use your image online in advertising? Do you allow us to post your name online? Do you consent to anything that might happen and waive all liability and you won't sue us and all of that fun stuff? So let's just go ahead and add some of that. Do you consent to us posting your photo online? And then this is going to be an input. And instead of a radio button, it's going to be a checkbox. And in here, we'll just say the name is photo. And then now basically I'm going to highlight all of this and copy that, Shift Alt and then down arrow. Do you consent to us posting your name online? And we'll say photo, we'll call this photo consent, and then we'll call this one name consent. And now if you go ahead and save that, let's put actually a line break in between these two as well. So now if you save that, you can see you've got these two which are mutually exclusive, and then these two which are not. I can select one or the other or both or none. So that's how radio buttons and checkboxes are different. And then after that, you have a date input. So for example, let's add another breakdown here and then another div. And let's say we need to get the date of birth for this student. Well, we can say input date, and then our name, we'll just call it DOB. And if I hit save, now I've got this date of birth input. And if I click on there, I can select whenever somebody was born, probably not in 2023 if you're taking this class. So who knows when you were born? Maybe, I don't know, February of 2000. So there we go. And that's pretty much how you input a date. That's pretty simple. There's not really a lot complicated to that, at least with this basic HTML date input. After that, what if we want to upload like files? Well, we can do that. Like if we want to upload like a face or a ID card image for a student, let's make another div down here with another line break in between. And then inside of this div, what we're going to want to put is we're going to say upload image. Of course, on all those forms, they make you do like your 2x2 passport size photo. So we can say that, and we'll say input file. And if you hit enter, well, this is going to let us do really any type of file. Now, if I hit save in here, you can see I get this upload image. And if I click choose file, and I come into maybe a folder where I have a bunch of things, you can see I can choose these image files, but I can also choose, like for example, this is an XCF file, which is a GIMP file. I should not be able to choose that. I can also choose MP4 files, which I don't want to be able to choose. So if I want actually an image, what I need to do in here is say accept, and then inside of my accept, I need to specify that I only want images. And I can specify like, oh, I only want JPEG files, but really I want any image file that I want to allow a JPEG or a PNG or whatever. As long as it's an image, it's okay. So now if I save that and then come in here to choose my file, go to that same folder, now all those XCF files, they don't appear, only the image files. So I can choose my picture and click open, and it tells me right there, okay, you've chosen avatar.png. And that's basically how you use a file uploader. Next, if we want to go ahead and read in the maybe the address for the student, we can use a text area for that. So to do that, let's make a new div, and then inside of this div, I'm going to say address and then text area. And if you don't know what a text area is, just save that and you'll see it's basically an input box that we can type in. But the difference between like this text area and this one up here, this input text, is that this is just a single line input, whereas this is, I can put as many lines as I can fit in there. And actually I can resize that, at least by default, to whatever size I want. And you'll notice right now, at least, this looks pretty bad. You've got the address down here, and if this is big enough, well, then you have all this blank space here, and it just doesn't look good. And again, we'll fix this when we get to CSS, but for now, I'm just going to put a line break in there. And there we go, we've got the address and then this box below it. But this box isn't quite big enough for an address, and we don't really want the user to have to come in here and to resize it like that. So we need to actually fix this a little bit. First, I'm going to say name is equal to address. And then after that, we can say cols, COLS, and that's going to be equal to maybe 30. And then if you save that, you can see now that we are that wide. And if I change that to maybe 40, you see it gets wider. And that's essentially, think of like a spreadsheet where your columns are going along the top, where you have one column here and then one column here, and then you have columns kind of layered after each other. So this cols, this is essentially defining how long you want it to be. And then after that, for rows, we can also tell it how tall we want it to be. So if I say maybe 10 and save that, you can see that now should be plenty big enough for a user to add their address without having to adjust it. So that's how you use a text area. And again, we've got this name, and really if we want to read from this later, we should give it a unique identifier. So ID is equal to address. And the reason you would give it a unique identifier, because if I want to read in the address, I want to make sure that what I'm reading in is in fact the address and not from some other field. So it's best to read from the ID field. So we're going to have that in address. Let's give this actually an ID as well. We'll call this image upload, and we'll call this one DOB, and then we'll call this one name consent, and this one we'll call photo consent. Man, I missed a lot of these. That's okay. I'm not going to go back and fill them all. It doesn't really matter because we're not actually doing anything with it right now. I'm just demoing how you can use these different form pieces to put a form together, but we're not actually going to read the data in because we don't know JavaScript yet. So until we get to JavaScript, then it's not that big of a deal. So here's our address and then our text area. After that, let's see, what else would we want after that? Whoa, we want a way to actually submit this data to somebody. So to do that, we can come down here and let's do another break and then another div. And inside of this div, let's put some buttons. So let's say I say input, and then this one, we could say submit. And now if I save that, you'll see I get this tiny little button there with nothing on it. Well, I don't really want a button with nothing on it. I want a button that tells the user what they're doing. So if I'm submitting, if this is my input, my submit input, then I want the button to say submit form or submit or something like that. So now if I save that, you can see the button says submit form. And if I add another one down here, if I say input reset, and if I save that again, you get a blank box. But if I change that, I can say reset form and save that. Now you've got two buttons, a submit form and a reset form. And actually, if I type stuff in here, and then if I click reset form, it's actually going to know already to reset everything within that form. And if I type stuff in and submit it, it is in fact, oh, it's going to tell me to enter a number. If I click submit, it's going to say can't get scripts.js because, of course, this scripts.js file doesn't actually exist. We didn't make that because, again, we don't know JavaScript yet. But it does actually submit the form. So this is a submit button, and then this is a reset button. Then finally down here, we can have one more button, and we can say input, and this is simply going to be of type button. So to do that, we could just say input button, and then in here, I'll just say click me for now. And basically, this is going to be a button that is going to execute our own functionality. So not a submission or a reset, but really whatever we want it to do. And once we get to actually learning JavaScript, we'll worry about how we actually implement that button. But here's how you make it on the HTML form. And oh, actually, one more form that I forgot in here. If we add another breakpoint, and then down here, let's actually add an HR as well. So if you don't know, an HR is kind of like a a horizontal division line to kind of help space out different things in HTML, which again, you don't use that a whole lot after you get into CSS. But before we get into CSS, that does make it look just a tiny bit cleaner. So now in here, let's add one more div, and then inside of this div, we are going to have a select tag. So for this course, let's just look at maybe technologies that we're going to be learning. So I can say web dev tech, and then after that, I'm going to say select. And finally, inside of this select, we're going to have option, and my option values. Basically, we can copy this line quite a few times. And in here, we can put whatever value we want. So we can say HTML, we can say CSS, JavaScript, React, Node.js. We can say MongoDB, and then maybe Figma. Who knows? Now, if I save that, you can see that, let's see, we've got this drop down here where I can choose any of those that we had in there before. Now, let's just say I want to have one of these assigned by default, maybe React, for example. All I need to do is come in here and say selected. Now, if I save that, you'll see it defaults, instead of to HTML, the top one, it defaults to React, the one that's selected. And I could actually do the same thing for the checkboxes and then for the radio buttons. So if I wanted, for example, mail to be selected by default, all I do after up here, I would just say checked. And then with the checkboxes, let's say we want the consent to be kind of default. And then if they are like, they really don't want it, we want them to have to go in and make that change. So we can have it checked by default. And then we can have this one checked by default as well. Now, if you load the page, it's going to have mail selected by default, and it's going to have both of these consents checked by default as long as React selected. So that's just some of the different ways that you can use all of these different forms to read in information from your user through your application. Hopefully this has been a helpful video for you. Definitely, if you had trouble or if you were confused by any of it, go back and watch it again. And I encourage you to follow along with the video as I do it so that you can see in your own code how small changes that we make are affecting your own application. So definitely like this video and subscribe to this channel, and we will see you in the next video.